Welcome back, educators. I'm your host, Laura Paz Huerta, and I want to welcome you back to the Transformative Pedagogy podcast, where we're going to be cultivating equity in education. I'm excited to share today's episode with you and continue with our journey in the realm of social justice and education, exclusively how it impacts K through 12 students, which is our bread and butter. Also, how we as educators can evolve and bring this into our classrooms in a meaningful and impactful manner. As someone who's been an educator for 7 years, teaching all levels of Spanish, and recently beginning my journey as an educator for the English language development classes, or ELD, I've seen firsthand the incredible impact that culturally responsive teaching can have on student success. In this episode, we're diving into two incredibly important topics. The first one being the importance of culturally responsive teaching and how it can be implemented, as well as the impact of implicit bias in education. We're going to start off by discussing culturally responsive teaching, what it is, why it's essential, and how educators can integrate it into their classrooms. Then we're going to explore implicit bias, how it affects student outcomes, and what steps we can take as educators to recognize and mitigate our own biases. Now, whether you're new to teaching or you're a bit of a seasoned educator, I hope that you find today's episode informative and empowering. And as always, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey to be the best teachers that we can be. All right, let's get into the first part of our episode today, culturally responsive teaching. So what is it? As a Spanish and ELD teacher, I constantly see the richness of culture in my classroom. So what exactly is culturally responsive teaching? It's a it's a pedagogical approach that recognizes the importance of including other students, cultural references in all aspects of their learning in your classroom. It's more than just celebrating diversity. It's about using the students' cultural knowledge, their experiences, and perspectives as a foundation for learning. So not only them feeling celebrated, right, but them seeing their culture being included in their classroom is essentially what is being seen here. So, research shows that culturally responsive teaching leads to improved academic outcomes. There was a study conducted by the National Education Association, also known as NIA, and it found that when students' cultural backgrounds are acknowledged and integrated into their education, they demonstrate higher levels of engagement and motivation, which in turn improves their achievement across multiple subjects. And why wouldn't it? You are seeing, or they are seeing, essentially, that you are taking them into consideration, and essentially, you're bringing their backgrounds into the classroom, you're acknowledging them, their presence. And so this teaching practice, right, goes beyond the curriculum. It's more of a mindset. And so when we engage with our students' cultures, we're validating who they are as individuals. And we're showing them that their identity is an asset, not something that gets left at the door as soon as they walk in. And this leads to a boost in student engagement, but also promotes a deeper understanding of the content because it's connecting to their lived experiences. So, according to Zaretta Hammond's research in culturally responsive teaching in the brain, Engaging with these students through culturally relevant pedagogy allows them to make those personal connections, right, with the material and in the classroom and with their culture. So it's promoting a deeper understanding. So Hammond found that students who felt that their cultural identities are being validated, those students were more likely to retain information and demonstrate improved critical thinking. So why is this important? Why is culturally responsive teaching so critical? Well, in classrooms such as mine or yours, students from a variety of cultural backgrounds, right? It's essential to move beyond a one size fits all approach. And I feel as if that's the case for many of us, especially when we are first starting off in the classroom. But as teachers and educators, we're always evolving. And truth be told, being culturally responsive is something we should truly be learning and applying. If students don't see their lives, families, or communities reflected in the lessons, they're going to feel disengaged, even invisible at times. So it's especially important in subjects like language learning, where culture is tied so closely to language acquisition and communication styles. However, I'm not leaving my other subjects out as well. You can always include a little bit of culture in every subject material. Now, there's more research that shows us that culturally responsive teaching helps bridge that gap between students' lives outside school and the content they are learning inside school. So, when we're acknowledging and incorporating their cultural identities into the learning process, right, we're building a more inclusive and supportive environment for our students. I've seen this firsthand in my own classrooms. There's students who are more motivated, more confident, and willing to take more risks in their learning, whether it's to ask for more help, whether it's to ask their peers for help. When we usually see a bit of, you know, reservations when talking to others, that goes up, flying out the window as soon as they see that they're being incorporated into the language. Now, I have examples such as considering students who speak a language other than English at home, right? Without culturally responsive teaching, we can see that they might struggle to find connections between their home language and school content. So, by embracing their linguistic and cultural backgrounds, we can help students see their multilingualism as a strength as opposed to a barrier, which is how sometimes they feel. Now, the National Equity Project brought about research that states that students who feel that their cultural identity is validated in the classroom are 1.5 times more likely to participate in these class discussions, right, when they're being held in the classroom. They also tend to ask more questions, engage more with the material. And in schools with culturally responsive teaching practices, student attendance rates improved by 5 to 10%. The Education Trust also found that students in classrooms where teachers practice culturally responsive teaching outperformed their peers in comprehension assessments by an average of 15%. So, by drawing connections to real world, culturally relevant examples, these students were able to develop a more profound understanding of the content that was being taught to them, which is, in my opinion, is so amazing to see firsthand. All right. Now let's dive into how you can start implementing culturally responsive teaching in your classroom. As educators, we have the power to create these learning experiences for our students that reflect the diversity of their cultural backgrounds. Well, I'm going to share some strategies that have worked well for me. The first one being getting to know your students, which is a strategy I find to be very foundational and very important. You can't teach responsibly if you don't know who your students are. Learn about their backgrounds, their cultures, and their lived experiences. In all my classes, I spend time at the beginning of the year getting to know my students, not only their linguistic and cultural backgrounds, but their likes and dislikes. And I don't stop there. I continue on with the school year because I have to demonstrate that they are important to me, whether it is only a year or less. I have to show them that I'm trying to build this trust with them. And essentially, this helps me tailor my lessons to be more relevant to them. Their likes and dislikes are uber important into making sure that they see that I care, especially when it comes to content and making sure they understand it with what they see and know and is part of their everyday life and culture. An additional strategy is integrating cultural content into curriculum. So I include diverse voices and perspectives in my lessons, which is very important to me. And including these diverse voices and perspectives, right? So incorporating stories, music, and text from different languages, right? Different cultures. This helps my students connect with the material on a cultural level. With my Spanish classes, right, I tend to have the TED Talk videos, right, as warm-ups, and the um curious videos made from all over the world or news clips to reflect not only the language being learned, right, but different ethnic backgrounds as well, cultural backgrounds, so that they can see that it doesn't stop just there. This helps my students connect with the material on a cultural level. And they also learn about perspectives beyond their own. This can be done with any subject, really, whether it's math, science, or history, by making sure to include these examples from from just about anything. It makes sure that they understand it with what they see and know and is part of their everyday life and culture. Essentially, we can also integrate their cultural content into the curriculum. Additionally, using differentiated teaching methods is important. Understanding that different cultures have different communication styles and learning preferences, right? Some students might be more comfortable with collaborative learning, while others might prefer independent work. For instance, in my classes, I often use group projects where students can share aspects of their culture. So this fosters like collaboration and respect for different viewpoints and different ways of living and different different foods, different music, different just ways of life. And the students are learning about each other, which is really, really, really nice to see. So making sure that you allow these opportunities for different types of learning styles as well is key. One of the important strategies here is to create an inclusive environment. So the physical and emotional space of the classroom matters. It's essentially a key part of this. By ensuring that your classroom is a welcoming environment for all students, right? You're making sure that you're reflecting that you care about the diversity of the classroom. So including decorations and materials that reflect your students, right? From posters to resources, things like that. It creates that inclusive environment. For example, I teach Spanish and I teach ELD. So I include decorations that reflect, the Spanish speaking countries. And I include decorations that include, cultural backgrounds of my English learners and maps of the world, things like that. So, having bilingual resources, not only in English and Spanish, but to reflect, my students who speak different languages as well. That makes it an inclusive environment. So also, making sure that there are other influential and positive figures in various languages, that's also a great way to create an inclusive environment. And it sends a message that all cultures and cultural backgrounds are valued here. And finally, my last strategy for this, I would say to continuously reflect on your own teaching. And I think that's one of the most important ones out of all of these strategies, because essentially, as teachers, we're trying to, evolve and make sure that we're doing the correct thing. And if not, to modify it. So, as educators, continuous reflection is crucial. It allows us to become aware of our practices and assumptions. Whether we realize it or not, we all bring our cultural perspectives and experiences into the classroom. So these can unconsciously, like influence how we teach and interact with our students on a daily basis. So not only reflecting on our teaching practices helps us identify moments where we may be unintentionally prioritizing one cultural perspective over others. It can also allow us to see when they occur in subtle ways. So, like, for example, focusing on things that align with the dominant culture. So, an example of that would be my ELD class. A majority of them are Spanish speakers. However, I do have a community of Urdu students, a community of Vietnamese students, and a community of Lao students as well. And so I need to make sure that I take all of them into consideration and not just the Spanish speaking community. And reflecting on that and understanding that I need to make sure that I take them all into account is super important. So, making sure that I continuously reflect on my own teachings, right, is a super important. And just so you know, reflection doesn't have to be such a formal process. It can be small. It can be an everyday question like, whose voices are being centered in my lesson plan? Or do my classroom materials and examples reflect the diversity of my students? As well as, am I creating opportunities for all students to share their experiences and perspectives? So regularly asking yourself these kind of questions helps ensure that you're touching all your bases, that your teaching is inclusive. So you may find it helpful to keep a reflective journal, participate in peer observations, or even seek feedback from your students on how they experience the classroom environment. So I've experienced this myself, but reflection can be a humbling process, especially when it comes from your students. Sometimes they can be dreadfully honest, but sometimes we need to hear that. And it's okay. I've had my own moments with this, and it's as if we can see so we we're on the train, we're going through the tunnel, right? We're seeking our reflections and we see the light at the end of the tunnel and it throws a wrench in our tracks, right? So reflection is like that. We get thrown a wrench sometimes, but in order to reach that good level of reflection, right, for our teaching, we see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we have to reflect. And that's okay. It's necessary for growth. And we'll get there. So don't freak out if you think you're not going to get there, because you will. All right. So let's move into our second topic, which is implicit bias in education. And when we're talking about implicit bias, this is referring to the unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that affect our actions, our decisions, and interactions in the classroom. So essentially, these biases often come from our cultural conditioning and societal messages. And while we may not be aware of them, they can deeply affect how we interact with our students. So, as educators, it's important to acknowledge that these biases can impact how we treat students, whether it's in the way we discipline, assess, or even how we greet students when they walk through the door. It's super important that we're aware that these biases exist and that we need to work on them in order for our students to succeed. So, implicit bias can manifest in various ways, often unconsciously. Studies have shown that students of color, particularly Black and Latino students, are more likely to face these harsher disciplinary measures compared to their white peers for similar behaviors. Additionally, teachers may have lower academic expectations for students from certain backgrounds, which can lead to those students underperforming. So, there were studies done by the US Department of Education, so their Office for Civil Rights, back in 2014, that stated that Black students are nearly 4 times more likely to be suspended than white students for similar offenses, and that Latino students are also suspended at higher rates, though at a lesser degree. So the report essentially highlighted that while Black students represented only 16% of the student population, they accounted for 42% of suspensions and 31% of expulsions. Additionally, there was research done by the National Bureau of Economic Research that found that students who are disciplined more frequently are subjected to lower expectations in K to 12 education are 30% less likely to attend college, with Black and Latino students disproportionately affected. It's been my own experience to not only notice, but encounter that these biases can subtly affect the way students are treated in group settings. For example, right, my quieter students or students who are barely arriving to the country and learning English are less likely to be called upon by myself in class simply because of the assumption that they aren't ready to participate yet, that they might feel insecure. So it's been my experience, and I will acknowledge that sometimes I did have these thoughts, and this was the case. These small moments can add up, leading to students to feel less valued or less capable, and you don't give them the opportunity to show how they are progressing, which essentially hinders their education, if you think about it. So, what can we do to mitigate the impact of implicit bias in our classrooms? While we can't completely erase our biases, we can essentially take these steps to become more aware of them and to make more equitable decisions. I have some strategies here that I believe to be helpful and can help you in the classroom as well. The first one being, once more, self-reflection. Take the time to reflect on your biases. Ask yourself, are there certain students I tend to favor in class discussion? Or do I hold different expectations for different groups of students? You're being honest with yourself, right? And in doing so, you're starting to identify areas where bias might be influencing your teaching, sorry. Self-reflecting can be really hard because think of it as pulling off the blindfold we didn't know we had. And by holding ourselves accountable to these questions and these reflections, you're growing as a teacher, you're growing as a professional, and you're growing as a human being. Another strategy would be engaging in professional development. I know. Another PD, right? However, many schools do offer implicit bias training. Take advantage of those trainings and PDs. Those workshops can be invaluable in helping you as an educator and to recognize and address these biases. So seek out those opportunities to learn more about equity, diversity, and even inclusion. The more informed we are as educators, the better equipped we are to create these equitable learning environments. The Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity did some research on this, and it showed that schools implementing implicit bias training for their staff saw a 25% reduction in racial disparities in suspensions and expulsions. So within 1 year of the training, this saw an effect of reducing the over disciplining of Black and Latino students. Building relationships with all students is another strategy here. So the American Psychological Association, or APA, found that Teachers who develop strong positive relationships with their students were 35% less likely to make stereotypical assumptions about students' abilities based based not only on their race, but their background as well. So these relationships helped mitigate implicit biases and allowed these teachers to assess students more fairly and more accurately. Overall, having stronger and more meaningful relationships with your students, you're less likely to make those assumptions about their abilities based on stereotypes. So try to get to know each student individually. You know, their strengths, their interests, the challenges they face. In my classes, I make it a point to engage with each student regularly, both inside and outside of class, to better understand their needs and their goals. A regular, hey, how are you today? Or, hey, have you been having a good day? Or have you been having a bad day? If I see that they look tired or just, not happy. This has such a meaningful impact on a student's day. It's an opening to show that you care and the students see that. For example, I have a student who loves anime. He will wear anime t-shirts. He will be doodling anime cartoons. His Chromebook has an anime show background. And I will ask him, hey, what episode of so and so anime are you on today? What's going on there? And this is before class as he's taking his materials out. And he lights up. And I see that every time I engage with him like that, he'll participate more in class. So I've seen it firsthand how building relationships with your students, and asking them about their interests, even if it's just for a quick 1-minute conversation, they're more likely to try in the classroom. Another strategy would be diversifying your teaching methods, Avoid relying on just one method of teaching. And I know sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And so by varying your instructional techniques, you can create opportunities for all of your students to shine, not just a specific amount. For example, if I'm working with a class that includes both native Spanish speakers and students who are new to the language, I might use pair work or small group activities where students can support each other's learning. So this essentially helps to break down biases about who's good at learning. There was a research done by the Center for Research on Education Outcomes, or CREDO, and they specifically highlighted that inclusive teaching practices include varying instructional techniques and using peer support. This helped reduce biases with students' abilities. So in classrooms where these practices were being implemented, there was a 22% reduction in achievement gaps based on those students' backgrounds and initial language proficiency levels. And last but not least, fostering an inclusive classroom culture. So this strategy, right, is used to create a classroom environment where your students feel safe to not only express their identities, but share their experiences. So I openly encourage open dialogue about diversity and bias, even if it's small, discussions in class. For example, in my classes, I often help facilitate discussions where students can talk about their own cultural experiences, which not only helps reduce bias, but it also builds empathy and understanding amongst students. And it's really, really interesting and great to see. All right, my educators, we are coming to the end of today's episode. And truly, I want to thank you for your attention and for listening to today's episode. So, before we end today, I want to quickly summarize today's discussion. or today's episode. So, we discussed the fundamental principle of culturally responsive teaching, recognizing and valuing students' cultural backgrounds. This approach starts with understanding that students bring their own unique experiences, their own unique values, and their own unique perspectives to the classroom. So, when we as educators integrate these cultural references into our teaching, we're not only respecting our students' identities, but also using their backgrounds as a powerful tool for learning. Use it to your advantage. For instance, incorporating culturally relevant examples and materials into the curriculum helps students see their own lives reflected in what they are learning, which makes the content more meaningful and more engaging. We covered how culturally responsive teaching fosters a more inclusive learning environment. So, by connecting lessons to students' cultural context, we create a space where all students feel seen and valued. So, this approach is known to improve student engagement and motivation. Research supports this, and students feel their cultural backgrounds are being respected and incorporated into their learning, and they're more likely to participate actively and perform better academically. This happens because they see that their identities are assets, not just obstacles. And this leads to boosting their confidence and enthusiasm for learning. Next, we talked about how this teaching method helps to reduce educational disparities. So, when we as educators are making an effort to understand and incorporate students' cultural backgrounds, we're addressing potential biases that may arise from a one size fits all approach to teaching. For example, students who might struggle with a standard approach may excel when they see their own cultural references and experiences woven into the lessons. So this well, this personalized approach helps in closing that achievement gap and making education more accessible and equitable. Moreover, we discussed the practical application of culturally responsive teaching. This involves not just tweaking the curriculum, but adopting a mindset that continually seeks to understand and integrate the diverse cultural assets of students. It's about making thoughtful decisions in how we're designing our lessons, how we're interacting with students, and how we're assessing their learning. So, engaging with students regularly, learning about their interests, and incorporating their feedback into our teaching practices are all vital steps in making culturally responsive teaching effective. In summary, culturally responsive teaching is not a static method, but an ongoing reflective practice. It requires us to continuously learn and adapt in response to the diverse needs of our students. So, by validating these students' cultural identities and making their experiences central to the learning process, we not only are enhancing their educational experience, but also contributing to a more inclusive and equitable classroom environment. So, educators, I want to thank you for listening to today's episode on culturally responsive teaching. I do hope that this exploration has provided valuable insight into how we can better serve our diverse student populations and make a positive impact in our classrooms. So, if you're driving home or relaxing, I wish you a great day. So, educators, today's episode was brought to you by with the help of some incredible research on culturally responsive teaching. and implicit bias in education, as well as student achievement. And for more insight into culturally responsive teaching, we reference Geneva Gay's Culturally Responsive Teaching Theory, Research, and Practice, which explores the importance of integrating students' cultural backgrounds into education. We read into Zaretta Hammond's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, linking neuroscience with teaching strategies to promote authentic engagement. We have Gloria Latson Billings' The Dream Keepers, which highlights successful educators who effectively support African American students. On implicit bias in education, we looked at Walter S. Gilliam and colleague studies from Yale University, which examines how implicit biases influence disciplinary decisions in early education. The U.S. Department of Education's Civil Rights Data Collection outlined disparities in school discipline practices. Charles Statt's Understanding Implicit Bias, which provided strategies for educators to recognize and address their biases. And finally, on the achievement gap in student outcomes, we referenced Linda Darling Hammond's The Flat World and Education, which examines the systemic inequalities in U.S. schools, as well as Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's groundbreaking study on stereotype threat, revealing how biases can impact the academic performance of minority students. So again, educators, we encourage you to explore these works for a deeper understanding of these crucial topics. So once more, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. And just a little reminder, if you could go ahead and complete the survey attached to the email for today's second episode, I would truly, truly, truly appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a good night.